Hi, I'm Jason at Fraser Valley Rose Farm. Well, my roses are all resting for the winter here, and I thought I would take that moment to explain a little bit about the difference between own root roses and grafted roses. I have some samples here, and also out in the garden I'll be showing you what happens when your grafted rose throws a sucker, a root sucker, and how that can be a problem for you in the garden. So first I thought I would explain what is the difference between own root roses and grafted roses. So when you have a seedling in nature, the first thing it does is it throws out its own roots. And so these are on the same roots as the top of the rose. Also, when I do cuttings in the greenhouse, I take a cutting, I stick it in soil, and it throws roots as well. And all of those roots, again, are genetically identical to the top of the rose. The only way you're going to get a grafted rose is if that's part of the production system of the people who produce the rose. So this would be an example. This is a grafted rose, this is Don Juan, and all of this area down here is from the rootstock. And that's grown in the field separately. And then what they do is, like you would see on grafting fruit trees, they cut a slit in there, they put in a bud from the top stalk, and then they allow it to grow together for a year or two, and then produce these big healthy canes on the top. There's a reason why they did this, and although oftentimes you'll see it explained as the rootstock is stronger or the rootstock is more disease resistant, and some of that may be true, I think the main reason why we started grafting roses was as a production system. It was a good way of getting a lot of roses to market very quickly if you didn't have a lot to take cuttings from. So you could take a bud instead of a whole section, graft it onto some existing rootstock in the field, and that would hasten the release of roses to market, especially for varieties that were a little more exotic or interesting, and you wanted to get them to market fast. So that was the way they used roses for grafting. Now, one negative impact of this, at least by my opinion, is that during the time that grafting was at its height, they really didn't evaluate roses for the ability to grow well on their own roots. So it didn't really matter. They could take a promising seedling, take off the buds, put it onto grafting, see how it performs, and it really didn't matter how it performed on its own roots. In fact, the assumption was pretty much made that every rose would be grafted, which isn't the case so much today. There's been a big resurgence in the rose industry on growing roses on their own roots, and it is the way that I do it mostly here, partly to do with the troubles with having rootstock suckers. Also, this bud union here becomes a bit of a weak point in the rose, and because it's the place where the graft happened, there's a lot of callus tissue in there, and there's a lot of place for disease. It's they often describe it as the most vulnerable part of a rose. So if you want a long-lived rose, and you want a rose that's that only ever suckers from its own genetic material, then it's on its own roots. And so the unfortunate part is that for all those roses that were bred in that period of time when they weren't evaluating for their own root health, some of them are real weaklings on their own roots. So that's something that I have to evaluate now on the farm quite a lot. I grow a variety, I have to see if it grows well on its own roots because they never bothered to check that when they were breeding the roses. So the next thing I want to show you is what one of those rootstock suckers look like. Follow me to the field. Alright, here I am in the garden, and while I was doing another project I noticed that Alfred Colomb here has some nasty rootstock suckers. So how would you tell that? This is the dormant season, so it might make it a little harder because you can't see the differences between the leaves. But I can definitely tell a difference in the stem. So if you look at this here, this is very characteristic of the variety that it's supposed to be. You can tell the thorns, you can tell the habit, and everything else. The overall height of this sort of usually is between 4 and 6 feet. It's a hybrid perpetual. And what I noticed is this guy sticking out of the same. It looks like it comes from the same plant. Hang on. And here we are. It's thrown a big long stem that's like probably 10 feet long in total, and it doesn't look the same. You see down here that it looks quite different than the ones up above there. That's because it came from the rootstock. When I purchased this variety, I purchased it grafted, put it in the garden here, and used it as a mother plant for what else I was growing. So now, just as it happens, the rootstock has found a way to throw a sucker, and I have to get that out of there. And for you, when you're doing this at home, you have to try to get it as low down as you can. So you want to reveal it right down to the base there. And even below ground if you can. In my case, I'm going to get it right around here. You can see what a pain that would be if you let the plant grow for a good length of time and it got out of balance like that, and you found that a quarter or a half or more than half of your rose was made up of the rootstock. Once it blooms, you realize that's not the rose you wanted at all. This is very likely something like a single rose or a dog rose or something like that, that really isn't that showy at all and isn't something that you would choose to grow in your garden, or at least in this case didn't choose to grow in your garden. So that's how you pull out the rootstocks there. Hang on, got one more. See that the plant put a lot of energy into growing a lot of material that I really didn't want. So getting that out of the way. Now, one other topic of conversation is that the argument is often made that plants that are grafted have more vigor and health and are just better growers than ones that are on their own roots. And there's some truth to that, but follow my logic here. If they never evaluated it for all those hybrids that they grafted, if they never evaluated it for health on its own roots, those ones, it's unknown. You have no idea, and it is quite possibly true that grown grafted on a rootstock is better than on its own roots. For other ones, if they've been evaluated and they grow well on their own roots, they can be just as strong. And I'll give you the example of, I grew a variety called Complicata. I still grow that, and I grow it in my garden off the grafted mother, and I grow it off of off of its own roots. And frankly, it's indistinguishable. I can tell no difference between the health, vigor, size, habit, or anything else to do with those two roses, except that one of them occasionally throws up all these root suckers that I have to take care of and cut out, and it's frankly just a bit of a pain in the butt. So that's the difference between those two. Obviously, if you had a rose that's a weaker grafted rose, or from a rose its own weak rootstock, that could be different, and you may be stuck with having to use it grafted or choosing not to grow that variety at all. A bit of wind here. I think I'll wrap it up then, and thanks so much for watching. Leave some comments below.